thrilled. Crosby always beats Ovechkin.
Larry Bird is
a molten cheese.
Kind of reflecting some comments that I had. Well, Tri-City Sports Now is privileged to have someone who a lot of people would say is the best sports writer in America. I'm speaking, of course, to John Feinstein, an author, a recent book that I've enjoyed reading, The Legends Club, which goes back several years to the glory days of ACC basketball with Dean Smith, Jim Valvano, and Mike Krzyzewski. But also, I caught him on Twitter this morning, kind of reflecting some comments that I had earlier in the show on Mitch Trubisky being drafted by the Chicago Bears and a reach, if you will, or at least they traded up for him. John Feinstein, it's very nice to have you on here, but let's just talk about the NFL draft yesterday. What was your opinion of the Bears trading, I guess it was 4 picks to move up one spot to get a quarterback who has started for 1 year of college football full time?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, Marky, I think it was a surprise to everybody, and the reaction that we saw, I can't remember because I was switching back and forth between ESPN and the NFL Network, but one of them had a shot of the Bears draft party after they announced the Trubisky pick, and people were like holding their heads going, oh my God, what have they done? What are they thinking? And I think a lot of us felt that way, that first of all, as you said, they gave up a lot just to move up one spot. I'm thinking that the 49ers bluffed them and said, you know, if you don't make this deal, we're going to take Trubisky. I don't think they were going to. They didn't take a quarterback. If they really wanted a quarterback, they still had the 3rd pick. They could have taken Deshaun Watson. They could have taken Patrick Mahomes. They didn't. I think they're waiting a year to get their quarterback, whether it's Kirk Cousins or someone in the draft next year, because they're going to pick high again next year because they're not going to be very good this year. So to give up that much to get, as you said, a guy who started 13 games in college, I thought was, to put it mildly, a reach. Now, sometimes reaches work out. Sometimes, you know, a scout or a general manager sees something that other people don't see. I remember when the Ravens drafted Joe Flacco, and a lot of people said, really, you're drafting a guy out of Delaware in the 1st round? What are you thinking? Well, they turns out they knew what they were doing. So for the sake of Bears fans, I hope all of us who think this was not a good pick are proven wrong, but I suspect we won't be.
Well, I really got a feel for John Fox here, because can you imagine his coaching future now depends on not only Trubisky, but Mike Glennon, who really didn't do a whole lot in Tampa Bay, and they're giving him $16 million. I theorized this. Could giving up those picks have been a way to kind of pay for Glennon's salary? You don't have to pay for a 3rd and a 4th rounder this year. I mean, has that been proposed to you?
I don't think any NFL team is in that kind of financial straits, Marky, because they're all richer than sin because of the TV deals. You know, I remember talking to an NFL owner during the lockout back in 2011, and I said, you guys can't possibly plead poverty. You're making too much money. And he said, no, we're not pleading poverty. We all make money. We just think we should make more money. So I don't think that was it. I think somebody inside that draft room, and I don't know who it was, whether it was Pace or Fox or one of the scouts, thought Trubisky is the guy, and they paid a lot for him. So as I said, you're right about John Fox. He better be the guy, although Glennon will undoubtedly be the starter at the beginning of the season, and then how soon Trubisky plays, I think, will depend a lot on how bad the team proves to be.
I was looking more at maybe salary cap numbers or something of that nature. Of course,
I don't think 3rd and 4th rounders have that big an effect on your salary cap.
All right. Who do you think the winners were in the draft?
Well, certainly the 49ers. I mean, you know, getting the guy they wanted by moving, even though they moved down one slot, and picking up those extra picks, both this year and another 3rd rounder next year. I thought that some of the other teams that did well. The team here in Washington, they got a guy, Allen's a very talented player, and teams passed on him because they're worried about his shoulders. I think teams get too caught up worrying about injuries. Guys recover from injuries. Bill Belichick once said to me when I was talking about Tom Brady's ACL and what kind of story it might be to chronicle his comeback season in 2009, and he looked at me and he said, John, players go through surgery, they rehab from surgery, they keep playing. It's not a big deal. So I was surprised that he fell that far. I think the Texans did great getting Deshaun Watson. I think he's the best quarterback in this draft. I saw him play a lot the last couple of years, and I think he does one thing that you can talk about 40 times. You can talk about arm strength. You can talk about, the tire run, whatever you want to talk about. Deshaun Watson does one thing that I think is pretty important. He wins. He wins football games, and that's the kind of guy I want on my team, and I think the Texans did very well in getting him at number 12.
I agree. I thought that, and I like you. I mean, how can you argue with Deshaun Watson? We saw him play on the field. People talking about, well, his velocity hasn't been timed that well. To me, that means he has touch. Were there any other losers in the draft that you saw, John Feinstein?
Well, I was disappointed, having grown up as a Jets fan, that they passed on the chance to get Watson. I thought the Browns, after making the Browns pick, with the number one pick, is a little bit of a reach. This is a guy who has great ability, but again, one of the networks showed a lot of plays last night where he just took the play off. And you worry about someone like that, especially when you're talking about the number one pick in the draft. I mean, a lot is always expected out of the guy who's taken with that first pick, and you hope that he'll bring a different level of intensity. And Browns have picked up a lot of draft picks, and that's a good thing to do usually, but then the question becomes, what do you do with them? Do you take advantage of them? And I'm not sure that they did that last night. Again, they were sitting there with the 12th pick. They could have taken Watson. They opted to trade back with Houston and not take him. Their history with quarterbacks, as you know, was terrible. And I thought they passed on a guy who could have been their QB for the next 10 years last night.
That's a possibility. I would say there might be somebody in the later rounds. We don't know. The one
Could
thing,
be. You're right, because, look, Dak Prescott went in the 4th round last year.
Sure.
And you never know. I mean, Brady, of course, is the ultimate example going in the 6th round. But I was surprised also, Marky, at the number of receivers and running backs that went as high as they did. I think there were 5 of the first 9 picks. That hasn't been the trend. I was surprised Tom Coughlin took a running back with all the weaknesses the Jaguars have, that he would spend the 4th pick in the draft on a running back and not maybe shore up that defense, which was so bad, or even go for one of the quarterbacks, because as I'm sure you've heard during this offseason, there's some serious questions about whether Blake Bortles is going to be the guy there.
Sure. I'm seeing, again, some projections. Perhaps Kaiser going to the Jaguars, perhaps Nate Peterman. That seems to be a popular pick, either the 49ers or the Jaguars. That would be a great place for him to wind up, the former Tennessee quarterback turned Pitt transfer, because it would give him a chance to play as a third-round pick.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's playing time there. And Kaiser, to me, is the mystery pick among the quarterbacks, because he's got the size, he's got the physical attributes that I know teams look for, but he was very inconsistent. I mean, obviously he was injured last year, but even when he played 2 years ago, he was very inconsistent. He had great moments and he had terrible moments. So to take him in the 2nd or 3rd round, I don't think that's a bad idea for somebody. They might very well get a good quarterback.
Well, one last note on the draft, and you were mentioning the Browns. They need players, and 3 players in the 1st round I thought were pretty good. The one pick that I really liked is when they traded up to 29 with the Green Bay Packers and took David Njoku, because I think I'm pronouncing his name right. But anyway, the tight end from Miami. And the reason why is that I heard the Steelers were very, very high on him, and that was who had the next pick. And so if you can take...
That's obviously why they did it.
If you can take that guy away from the division champs and your arch rival... I was telling the story, you may remember this, of way back in 1987 when the Browns took Mike Junkin and kind of reached for him, a linebacker out of Duke, and it just disrupted the entire draft, and it allowed Rod Woodson to trickle down to the Steelers at number 10 and really in time change the direction of both franchises with that reach to Junkin and a couple other in future years poor drafts by the Browns. But I saw this as sort of being a reversal of that draft. You were able to get the player the Steelers wanted now in Njoku, and that could be pretty big because I think
it could. I mean, again, you never know. I mean, in every draft, you can look back in hindsight and say how different would history have been if so and so had gone to Team X as opposed to Team Y. And for example, there were a lot of people in what year was it? 1999, 1998, I think actually, who thought Ryan Leaf was going to be a better NFL quarterback than Peyton Manning. And so if the Colts had taken Ryan Leaf and the Chargers had taken Peyton Manning, how different would history have been?
That would be very different, but you'll find few people in Tennessee who would have thought that right
no,
there.
but I'm not saying they came from Tennessee.
I know that. I know that.
There were a lot of scouts who, Ryan Leaf's bigger. I mean, Peyton Manning's plenty big, but Ryan Leaf was bulkier, stronger arm, blah, 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 blah. Well, what they left out was that one guy was a football genius and the other guy was an idiot across the board.
True. And also, I think that you're looking at that point, maybe Leaf, who was coming out as a junior, had one more year, in his career, you could say, in the pros, because Manny had come back to Tennessee for his senior year. We're talking to John Feinstein. A lot of people think he is the best sports writer in America. You're working on a book on the Ryder Cup. Tell me about it.
Well, I've always been fascinated by the Ryder Cup. When I wrote A Good Walk Spoiled back in 1995, I actually started the narrative at the 93 Ryder Cup, which was the last time the U.S. won in Europe. Tom Watson was the captain then, as he was in 2014, and a lot of my main characters in A Good Walk Spoiled played in that Ryder Cup. So I started the book with that and just thought it was the best event I'd ever been to in golf, including all four majors, because it's unique. It's different, the team aspect, the pressures, representing your country, all of that. And I always wanted to kind of circle back and do an entire book on the Ryder Cup, and the timing just never was right until last year. And so I worked with both teams, with captains, vice captains, most of the players on the U.S. team, most of the players on the European team. Spent a lot of time with all of them before the matches began at Hazeltine, and then obviously was there throughout that week, and then circled back to everybody again to get their reflections on the week once it was over, and learned a lot about what goes on inside the team rooms, learned a lot about what goes into the decisions the captains make, both before the week on captains' picks and also on how they go about deciding on who's going to play with whom, some of the rivalries and friendships, and it was fascinating. And the book's called The First Major. It'll be out in October, and you can actually pre-order it now on Amazon, but it'll be out in October.
Well, that is great. I mean, I know that it's always said the smaller the ball, the better the book on sports. So yeah,
I'm not sure I buy into that. I remember reading a piece by George Plimpton in Sports Illustrated where he said that Season on the Brink was the exception to that rule. And the only reason, though, it was so successful was because of Bob Knight being such a fascinating character. And I actually met Mr. Plimpton. I was a huge fan of his at the Masters a couple of years later. And I said something about, well, I'm glad you found Bob Knight so fascinating in spite of my writing. And he said, oh, my God, I didn't mean it to come out that way. And he was very embarrassed. But a lot of very good books have been written on sports other than golf, but I'm one of those guys who loves writing about golf, too.
Well, we like reading it as well. We liked another good basketball book, and, I mean, the Season of the Brink, what can you say about it? I mean, ESPN is making movies about it and such.
Yeah, but a horrible movie, unfortunately, but you're right.
I will tell you, in all honesty, I heard a lot of build-up, and I remember turning the channel after a little bit.
That was terrible.
I didn't. Yeah.
Don't get me started on that. It was one of the more disappointing experiences in my life because, unfortunately, when somebody options a book, unless the producers want to give the author input, they don't have to. And ESPN thought they were smarter than me, and they could make the movie without my input, and the result was pretty brutal.
The one thing I remember was when you were doing, John Feinstein, the promotional circuit. And I think I once emailed you on this the first time I had you on the show, was that you were doing an interview with Myron Cope up in Pittsburgh. And you mentioned there were times when I was covering Bobby Knight where if I had a gun, I would have shot him.
Yeah.
And Myron just looked, at what point would it give us a circumstance where if you had a gun, you would have shot Bobby Knight? It was the most perfect. Taught me about follow-up questions. But
fortunately, I've never owned a gun, so Bob was safe.
The Legends Club, though, that was a book that I very much enjoyed reading the parts. I got to admit, the parts that I did, but we were talking off the air about Jim Valvano. I mean, uncovering that he had applied for the job at Duke before he had become the NC State coach. Who knew that? I guess when I look at that, though, when you look at the rivalry, how did North Carolina and NC State fall from that peak that it was? When I was a kid in North Carolina, that was the rivalry. Duke was this private school, might as well have been Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
How did that fall down? Yeah.
For most of the 70s, Duke people never wanted to hear that, but they were. NC State, of course, had great teams under Norman Sloan, the David Thompson, Monty Tao, Tom Burleson team that won the national title in 74, and then, of course, Jim's Miracle team that won the national title in 83. And in between, they were still very good, right through, with Jim being forced to resign in 1990, and then the program just went downhill after that, and struggled for many years. Has come back part of the way. Herb Sendek made 5 straight NCAA tournaments in the early 2000s, but it wasn't good enough for NC State people because, like you said, their feeling was it should be them and North Carolina. And by then it had become North Carolina and Duke. Krzyzewski had built the program to the point where he's now won 5 national titles. He's surpassed Dean Smith and everybody else in total wins, been to 12 Final Fours. And the fact that you've had Mike there as a Hall of Fame coach since 1980, and you've had Dean Smith, and then after a brief gap, Roy Williams, both Hall of Fame coaches at Carolina, that's made it very hard for the guy at NC State. He's kind of caught in the middle. Whoever it is.
I want to ask you, when I was a kid there, it felt like all the white-collar people rooted for North Carolina. And by the way, John Feinstein, people didn't know, he went to Duke, so he's got an inside field of this. There was a circumstance, I felt all the white-collar people rooted for North Carolina, all the blue-collar people rooted for NC State, and, Duke was over here, and I said they might as well have been Wake Forest or Clemson or somebody like that. But I thought it mirrored all the old stories I used to hear about New York baseball. The Yankees were the team of the white-collar people, and the Brooklyn Dodgers were the team of the blue-collar people. Can it be a parallel be made there between those 3 schools and, let's say, the Brooklyn Dodgers, New York Giants, and New York Yankees? Do you see any parallel there in your opinion, John Feinstein?
Well, of course, when you're talking about the Giants and the Dodgers and the Yankees, it was a different time in the world and in sports. The Dodgers and Giants left New York in 1958 and to move to California. But the triangle notion does fit. Of course, the difference is that the Yankees never played the Dodgers or the Giants unless 2 of them made the World Series, which happened quite a bit in the 40s and 50s. Particularly the Dodgers and Yankees playing in the World Series. The Giants and Yankees only played once in 1951. But, the Yankees were definitely, because they were alone in the American League in New York. The other 2 teams were in the National League. From 1949 to 1964, what did they win? 14 pennants in 16 years, something ridiculous like that.
Yeah.
So they were the dominant team. And I think Carolina played that role for many, many years. I mean, Dean Smith, between 1967 and the year he retired, 1997, 31 seasons, never finished lower than 3rd in the ACC. I mean, as good a basketball league as there is in the country, and the worst he finished during that stretch was 3rd, which is just an unbelievable record. But then Krzyzewski rose up to kind of meet him. Won back-to-back titles in 91 and 92. Duke became kind of the team of the 90s. They were the team that everybody wanted to beat nationally. and Krzyzewski's continued it for a lot of the 21st century. But now Roy Williams has sort of done to Krzyzewski what Krzyzewski did to Dean Smith. He's risen up, won 3 national titles on his own. So if you think about it, in the 21st century, there have been 18 national champions now, starting with the year 2000, and 5 of them have been either Duke or North Carolina. That's pretty amazing.
Especially when you consider that, in theory, 351 teams compete for it. In theory.
Yeah, and even if you break it down and say that realistically, there are maybe 40 or 50 schools that have the money and the wherewithal, the schools in the power conferences, to win a national championship, you're still talking about close to 1/3 of the national titles being won by 2 schools.
That's, yeah, and then you have, Kentucky, the great dominant teams and all that. The NCAA tournament can be a mistress that lures you in but breaks everybody's heart. So, last question, speaking of broken hearts, ESPN, laying off 100 people, many of them people obviously,
yep.
John Feinstein. A lot of people talking about, is ESPN too political? Is this a result of they've overpaid for, say, the NBA contract and such? What is your take on the layoffs at ESPN, and can ESPN ever regain its brand?
Well, ESPN, I don't think, has lost its brand.
Okay.
It's still ESPN. It's still the most powerful broadcasting entity that there is in sports, by far. But there's no question that mistakes have been made. I know a lot of people want to make the political argument. I saw a lot of people tweeting that it was because ESPN had gone so liberal and they didn't want to watch anymore, and the Caitlyn Jenner thing turned them off. Well, first of all, the Caitlyn Jenner thing wasn't political. The Caitlyn Jenner thing was a business decision trying to drive ratings for a bad show, the ESPYs. And in fact, if they really wanted to honor somebody as a transgender, it should have been Renee Richards, who did it 45 years ago, way before people actually started doing it more frequently now than back then, and when you faced a lot more prejudice as a transgender than you do now.
Yeah.
But the 2 major reasons that ESPN has kind of lost its way are, one, you brought it up, overpaying for rights fees. Now, you got to have the NFL. I understand that. But they so overpaid for the NBA. They were basically bidding against themselves, and went over $1 billion a year for the NBA, which I'm not going to go so far as to say it's a niche sport, but it's a lot closer to hockey in popularity than it is to the NFL. And why they paid that kind of money for the NBA, I don't know. People haven't even mentioned how much money they paid to get the rights fees for Wimbledon and for the U.S. Open and for the Australian Open. I'm a tennis fan, but again, tennis is a niche sport. And as I said, you got to decide where to spend your big bucks. You got to spend them on the NFL. They didn't have to spend them on the NBA the way they did. They probably didn't have to spend them on MLB the way they did, and they certainly didn't have to spend it on tennis the way they did. So they made some poor decisions there. And then there's just the trend in the world away from cable television. ESPN makes most of its money off of people paying, $4 to $7 into each cable package that people own, so that cable provider can give you ESPN. Well, they've lost 10% of those subscribers because a lot of, particularly millennials, they don't watch TV. My kids who are 23 and 18, my older ones, they don't watch TV. They watch Netflix and things like that. Even my 6-year-old watches Netflix now. So that's kind of out of ESPN's control, but they did a very bad job of seeing that coming and kept spending and spending and spending and spent themselves into a corner where now they feel the need to do all this because Disney's such a bottom-line company. And the shame of it is none of the executives who made these decisions got fired. The people who got fired were the foot soldiers out there doing all the work on air and on their website and things like that, who had nothing to do with the poor decision-making.
He's the best there is, and I'll tell you what else. I respect him because he's earning his own check as an author, which is something that as it goes from newspapers to the internet and all that becomes tougher and tougher to do. He's John Feinstein. Always love to have him on. Thank you so much for spending time with us on Tri-City Sports Now.